Hello, I'm Lira Marie Lond, and I'm with the Sound Museum Collective, and today I'm going to talk about electronic sound synthesis and how a better understanding of electronic sound synthesis is gained through a study of acoustic sound in the natural world. I think it's helpful for one who has an interest in learning how to use analog sound synthesizers, how sound works in the natural world. Because the way that sound works in the electronic world is identical to the way it works in the air with acoustic instruments as their source, or any sound for that matter. Electronics follow all the same rules for developing a sound. So they have the capability of making all of the same timbres one would hear from acoustic instruments, and much more that the imagination has yet to realize. All sound is characterized by its timbre, and timbre just means the identification of a sound. One identifies the timbre of a sound through its timbre. A flute has a completely different timbre than a violin, and the way that a flute makes a sound and the way that a violin makes a sound is the same as the way a synthesizer makes those versions of those sounds. So sound works with waves traveling through the air. When we hear sound, a crack of lightning, a book falling on the floor, fingers snapping, the air around the source of the sound is displaced, and the waves ripple out into the air. These waves, these displacements in the air, are picked up by our eardrums, which are very small diaphragm. And the air that's displaced, those molecules reach our ear, and we sense these very small disruptions in the air, and the diaphragm of our eardrum wiggles back and forth. This movement is translated by our brains as auditory perception. This same mechanism is at work in a microphone or a speaker. They both contain diaphragms. A microphone, for instance, you hold in front of you, and you speak into it or you sing into it, and the air around the diaphragm is disrupted, and the diaphragm, as it moves back and forth sensing these motions in the air, instead of how it works in our brain, when that signal is then converted into auditory perception by our brain, the simple circuit in the microphone converts the signals into electricity, which then can be recorded, or, if you're a noise musician, to make noise, or in a speaker, it works in reverse, and so that electrical signal goes into the diaphragm and it wiggles outward the air that we then hear as sound. So these waves can happen slowly, and if they happen slowly, we perceive them as low bass notes. If they happen fast, the waves ripple more frequently in the same amount of time. and we perceive that as a higher pitch. So we have waves, we have pitch, we have also this other word, frequency. So in a certain amount of time, however many phases a wave goes through would determine its frequency. So the more frequent in a certain period of time a wave goes through one phase, the higher the frequency. So frequency is one characteristic of a sound. We can perceive its pitch, we can perceive its loudness, and we can perceive its color with regard to brightness. But these are pretty basic things, and sound is, of course, capable of great complexity. Some sounds are richer than others, and some are duller than others. For example, a flute is a round, warm, duller sound when compared to a violin, which is a very bright, can be sometimes brash sound. And both of these instruments employ the same mechanisms for sound, and these mechanisms we find in the synthesizer. So what makes a sound sound like itself? What makes something sound characteristically flute-like or characteristically violin-like? And it really comes down to its harmonic makeup. And by that I mean what overtones are present, what harmonics are present in the sound. And so when we hear a sound, we can give it a certain frequency, like we've talked about. We can assign it, some amount of hertz or some amount of volume, some pitch. But a violin and a flute playing the same pitch doesn't really, tell us why the violin and the flute sound different. And they sound different because the flute, because it's air vibrating inside a pipe with one closed end, is limited in the amount of overtones that the instrument allows to be present. The instrument only allows even-numbered harmonics. So even though we only hear one tone, and that's the loudest tone, there are other tones present, overtones. They're just very, very quiet. So when the air is vibrating inside of a flute, we hear, say, a C or a G or a B flat. But there are all kinds of other notes present above that basic note, that fundamental note, the note that rings out loudest and clearest, the one that we perceive as a C or a B flat or a G. And there's a certain logic to these overtones. There's scientific ways one can understand why only even harmonics are present in a flute, but we don't have time to get into that today. A violin, on the other hand, has all of the harmonics. So if we look at the harmonic spectrum, at the very base, we have the fundamental. And so that's what we perceive as the true pitch, the true tone of whatever instrument. This is always going to be the loudest aspect of the sound, the fundamental. And we can see that over here. So if we observe frequency going up to the right and volume going up this way, the fundamental is always going to be the loudest. And then as the frequencies go up, the other notes that are present above the fundamental, they get quieter, but they're still there. But we really just perceive this one fundamental as the core frequency. But it's this stuff here and this stuff here that really makes a sound sound like itself. So a flute won't have the third, the fifth, the seventh harmonics. And so it'll sound hollowed out. And we can hear that when we listen to a flute. It sounds hollowed out. It doesn't sound as rich or as bright as a violin. And a violin has every harmonic overtone. And so naturally it's a richer tone with regard to harmonics. The second harmonic is the loudest above the fundamental. And that's always twice the frequency. So in the amount of time that the fundamental goes through one phase, the second harmonic will go through two. And that'll be an octave above the fundamental. And then likewise, the fourth will be 2 octaves above. And in between that, the third harmonic is a fifth. So even though we have 2 octaves, fifths, major thirds, a fifth above that even, this is all present in one sound. But we still only perceive that fundamental tone, C, B flat, G. But it's this stuff, in the DNA of a sound. That's what makes a sound interesting. That's what makes a flute sound beautiful and warm and inviting and sweet. Not that the violin can't sound sweet, but it has a completely different character. And so now that we know how sounds can sound different, we have to observe the other ways that instruments are unique. So a flute, it isn't like an instant start to the sound, and neither is a violin. When you blow into the flute, it's slightly gradual, as opposed to, say, a guitar, where you pluck a note and it's instantaneous. So here we're beginning to see how different instruments have different ways of making the sound happen. And even though the action is different for each of the instruments in beginning their sound, we're going to see how, when it comes to the synthesizer, we have complete control over those same mechanisms.